Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, The Diplomacy Imperative, Human Security, Illusory Security, and Nuclear Weapons. My name is Audrey Kitagawa, and I will be your moderator today. I'm the president and founder of the International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation, president of the Light of Awareness International Spiritual Family, and chair of the Anti-Racism Initiative of the G20 Forum and co-chair of its Gender Equality Working Group, and a member of its Advisory Council. This webinar is being hosted by the Living Earth Movement, which has diverse participation by leaders in the fields of theology, business, science, activism, civil society representatives, and faith communities who are passionate about combating climate change and preserving life on this planet. We also thank the co-sponsors of this webinar, the International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation, United Religions Initiative, Global Security Institute, and the URI Cooperation Circle, Voices for a Nuclear Weapons-Free World. Today, there is the real threat to the existence of life on Earth posed by nuclear weapons. We will explore the nuclear weapons issue in the context of the diplomacy imperative and human security. Before our speakers share, I would like to begin our webinar today by playing the Nuclear Prayer, a video produced by URI founder Bishop William Swing, which is said at the beginning of each convening of Voices for a Nuclear Weapons-Free World. You will see all three of our speakers today in this video. All of the speakers, including myself, are members of the Voices for a Nuclear Weapons-Free World. May we please play the Nuclear Prayer.
Each month, I have the great privilege of hosting a small group of diplomats, scientists, lawyers, religious leaders, and all of them are deeply involved in international nuclear weapons negotiations. I'd like you to meet these people, and then I'd like you to hear the prayer that we say whenever we get together.
I am Bill Perry. I'm a professor emeritus in the engineering school at Stanford University. I was the 19th Secretary of Defense of the United States, and before that, the Director of Defense Research and Engineering. My experiences through the years with nuclear weapons have made an indelible impression on me and convinced me that these immensely powerful weapons threaten no less than our own civilization. This has led me to make the primary task of my life working to ensure that they will never, ever be used again.
My name is Sidney Drell. I am a scientist, a physicist. Beyond my academic teaching and research career, I have spent many years as an advisor to the United States government on technical national security issues and nuclear weapons in particular. I recognize their almost unimaginable destructive potential and their capacity for destroying the human race. This is a capacity far beyond what we were created to acquire. And therefore, I believe and work to get rid of these weapons as soon as practical before they destroy humanity.
My name is George Shultz, former Secretary of State under President Ronald Reagan. And this is my own prayer. Dear God, please bring common sense and divine guidance to our work on the problems that nuclear weapons pose to our world. Man has invented a means to destroy us all. We must eliminate these weapons in order to preserve a sane and peaceful world. We pray for your help as we work toward this goal.
I am Ambassador James Goodby, and the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki have shaped my soul and my professional life, from my participation in the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty to my present efforts at seeking to dismantle, jointly with the Russians, the nuclear weapons legacy of the Cold War. President Kennedy said, "Here on Earth, God's work must truly be our own." I think that God's work is to rid the world of the present nuclear threat.
I am Monica Willard, The issue of eliminating nuclear weapons has shaped my life as a peace activist and as the representative of the United Religions Initiative to the United Nations. Knowing that nuclear weapons can be used by choice or accident, and that they have the capacity to destroy our planet and everything we love, calls me to action. A world without nuclear weapons is protection. For the love of our children, grandchildren, and future generations, for the beauty of the natural world, for a safer future, I offer this prayer.
I'm Jonathan Granoff. As a young man interning for a congressman, I met then Senator Robert Kennedy. He told us how close we came to destroying civilization during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He told us that eliminating nuclear weapons before they eliminate us is the practical and moral litmus test of our time. For many decades since, I've worked as an activist, an international lawyer, and a human being to rid the world of this threat. We need each other to do this, and we need God's grace.
I am Ambassador Thomas Graham, first with the Soviet Union, and later with countries all over the world. I have participated in arms limitation policy development and negotiations on behalf of the United States of America. Always, the overarching objective has been to control and eventually eliminate all nuclear weapons. And although much has been achieved in the past 70 years, the sword of mass destruction still hangs precariously over our heads. As long as there is breath in my lungs and urgency in my heart, I intend to do all in my power to banish these ungodly weapons from the face of the earth.
The beginning and the end are in your hands, O Creator of the universe.
And in our hands you have placed the fate of this planet.
We who are tested by having both creative and destructive power in our free will
Turn to you in sober fear and in intoxicating hope.
We ask for your guidance, and we wish to share in your imagination as we deliberate about nuclear force.
Help us to lift the fog of atomic darkness
that hovers so pervasively over our earth, your earth,
so that soon all eyes may see life magnified by your pure light.
Bless all of us who wait today for your presence
and who dedicate ourselves to achieve your intended peace
and rightful equilibrium on earth.
In the name of all that is holy and all that is hoped. Amen.
Amen.
Today, the doomsday clock stands at 3 minutes till midnight, the highest level ever recorded. Instead of global alarm and efforts at reduction, the opposite is happening. Nuclear nations are quietly gearing up to modernize and create new and more powerful nuclear weapons. Rogue nations are neglecting their citizens in favor of advancing their nuclear status. Rogue terrorist groups are frantically trying to obtain nuclear materials and weapons. Nuclear weapons are built to be used sooner or later. But rather than stepping back from the brink, the world is dashing to plunge over the cliff. In this moment of nuclear madness, what can we do? The nuclear experts whom I know pray. They live into the direction that their prayers take them. They become advocates, and they join with others to build a global voice of nuclear abolition. We invite you to do the same. Our little group is called Voices for a World Free of Nuclear Weapons, and we are part of the United Religions Initiative. If we can help you find your voice, feel free to reach out to us at uri.org. In case you think that your moral, spiritual voice is in the minority, please know every major religious group in the world has called for the abolition of nuclear weapons. Follow the prayer that is in your soul. Raise your voice. Save the world.
Amen. We are privileged to have on this webinar Ambassadors Thomas Graham and James Goodby and Jonathan Granoff. These three men have dedicated most of their lives to the goal of nuclear weapons abolition and disarmament. We are very privileged to have them with us today. As I introduce each of our speakers, you have seen already in the chat box their longer biographical sketches. And we will begin this conversation with Ambassador Thomas Graham, who is internationally known as one of the leading authorities in the field of international arms control and non-proliferation. Ambassador Graham served as a senior U.S. diplomat involved in every major international nuclear arms negotiation for almost 28 years. And he was the acting director of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency and a major figure in the adoption of the nuclear weapons test ban moratorium. He also served as the agency's general counsel. He was appointed by President Clinton as special representative of the President for Arms Control, Non-Proliferation, and Disarmament. Ambassador Graham, we have tuning into today's webinar several students and professors of international diplomacy. The beginning words in the title of this webinar are the diplomacy imperative. In light of the current tense situation with the war in Ukraine and President Putin's veiled threats since his invasion of Ukraine, the latest being issued yesterday, where he said, and I quote, "I want to remind you that our country also has new various means of destruction, and some components are more modern than those of the NATO countries. When the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we, of course, will use all means at our disposal to protect Russia and our people. This is not a bluff," end quote. Please share with us, Ambassador Graham, why diplomacy is so important, especially in the current environment of this very tense situation with the active war in Ukraine, missiles menacing a nuclear plant in South Ukraine, and President Putin's veiled threats to use nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you, RI, and others that contributed to this video for the opportunity to speak here today. I much appreciate it. I always take every opportunity I can reasonably receive to speak to this issue. Let me just first start. I'm going to talk a little about myself and then about Ukraine, but let me just open by commenting on the quote from President Putin that you just read out, Audrey. It's not just Russia he's referring to, it's Russia as he defines it, and we don't know what that means. It certainly includes, as Russia, the parts of Ukraine that he has conquered. That's actually where he says, if he so chooses, that he would utilize nuclear weapons to turn the situation around. But it may include other areas like Kiev or the Baltic states. Who knows? So it's not just a country self-defense statement. It's more than that. Diplomacy is as old as humanity. It's the basic way groups of human beings that form into coalitions or organizations or eventually nations are able to get along with one another. Peace is its objective, and stability. Winston Churchill famously said about an incident that took place in his career that where there was a way out through diplomacy. He said, jaw is always better than war. And I certainly have the same view. So the reason that I sought diplomacy as a career was I thought that working for peace among nations, peace among people, peace among groups was a very important thing to do and an important contribution to civilization. It requires learning many skills. You have to learn how to relate to one another very well. You have to try to understand the other side. You have to understand where it's important to be clear and where it's important to be ambiguous. I have myself escaped from several conflicts that seemed insuperable by the use of ambiguity, where each side decides to put a certain meaning on an ambiguous phrase. Paul Nitze, sort of maybe one of the dean of the Cold War diplomacy and analysis, who I worked with for many years, once told me that whenever I start one of these negotiations, he was referring to the Soviet Union, whenever I start one of these, I try to imagine in my own mind that narrow space where the two of us can stand comfortably. And once I've concluded in my own mind what that might be, I try to steer US policy in that direction. It's a pretty good way to look at diplomacy, I think. Just briefly, there was the status of a port in Turkey that was crucial to the conclusion of a treaty that served as the formal vehicle to end the Cold War. So it was really important. But what we did, we couldn't solve it between Greece and Turkey. And so we adopted a ambiguous formula, the last segment of the line between what areas are covered by restraints and what aren't is thence to the sea. And thence to the sea meant whatever you said it meant. And the Greeks said it meant one thing, the Turks said it meant another. Nobody complained, and the treaty entered into force. It's important to try to put yourself into the mind of your opposite number. Try to see the world as he or she sees it, so that you can better try to work things out. And personal relationships are tremendously important. During the struggle over indefinite extension of the NPT, one of my opposite numbers was Ambassador Mikhail of Mexico, who was a very capable diplomat. And the Washington Post wrote up a series of articles, of front page articles about this, 6 of them for 6 days. And the last one was showed Miguel and me in sort of set opposite each other, looking like we're about to strike one another. And then the headline was "Any Solution to NPT." And so that day was the opening day of the negotiation and the conference, and all the delegations were on the floor, including usually their foreign ministers. And the Mexicans were very near me, and so I looked over there, and I noticed that the Mexican foreign minister was there. And so I walked over and I approached him and I said, has anybody here read the Post this morning? And he winked at me and he said, yeah, we've all read it. And then Mikhail came up to me and he said, hey, Tom, why don't you and I stage a fist fight here on the floor of the General Assembly and we'll be front page again. That's the kind of relationship you want to try to develop with your opposite number. And just briefly through some of the things I worked on, I spent many years in the strategic arms limitation process, which was the START, SALT, INF, and I worked on stopping nuclear tests. I worked on the Conventional Arms in Europe Treaty, which ended the Cold War. But my primary focus always was on two things: eliminating nuclear weapons and ending the Cold War. And that was it. And if I might say, many people give put the end of the Cold War at the collapse of the Soviet Union, or the adoption of the Conventional Arms Treaty, but in my opinion, it was at a slightly different time when Ronald Reagan traveled to Moscow to exchange instruments of ratification of the INF Treaty. And just 3 years earlier, he had referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire. And he, at that meeting, after they exchanged the instruments, was walking around, strolling around Red Square, and arm in arm with Mikhail Gorbachev. And a reporter, seeing that, he walked up to the president and said, "Mr. President, do you think this country you're currently visiting is still the evil empire?" And the president looked directly at him and he said, "No, that was another time, another place." That's where you want diplomacy to take you. And that's what it's designed to do if it's successful. Now, turning to Ukraine, however, the situation, in my opinion, is far bleaker. I don't see any role for right now for diplomacy in Ukraine. It's a tremendously dangerous situation. Most people are concerned that if Putin is pressed up against the wall, which he isn't far from being, that he will fall back on nuclear weapons. And a fundamental of negotiation is to always leave an exit ramp for your opposite number so he can make peace with and not lose face. But I don't see any exit ramps. It's just, the problem here is that all three parties have made an existential situation out of this conflict. Putin thinks that if he loses the war, he'll lose his job as well. Ukraine thinks if they lose the war, they'll lose their whole country. And the United States and NATO think that if Ukraine loses the war, then maybe parts of NATO will be next on Putin's list, such as the Baltic states. So it's very complicated, and you just don't see how, right now, how you can find an exit ramp. You can't ask Ukraine to give up its country, and we know what you can ask NATO and the U.S. and Putin. And Putin well knows that it's a history of Russian statecraft that those leaders who lose wars usually lose their jobs. I mean, you think of Nicholas II after World War I. Think of Khrushchev after he fumbled the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Gorbachev didn't start Afghanistan, but he ended it on his watch and absorbed a lot of the blame, which led to his leaving, which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and his departing. One thing that does seem to be happening that gives hope here is that the allies of Putin, of the Russian leadership, seem to be slowly turning against them, and diplomacy can certainly help accelerate that process. And maybe if he feels himself weak enough in terms of allies, he will consider some kind of formula which preserves face and preserves Ukraine, its country. But that's a big if. But China has backed away somewhat. Modi, the Indian leader, publicly castigated Putin at the recent Shanghai communique meeting. And the Turkish president said that the lands of Ukraine that aren't under their control should be returned to their rightful owner. Those are three very important developments. But then, of course, you don't know what Putin will do if he truly has no friends, is backed against the wall, and is losing on the battlefield. That has to be considered as well when you're trying to work something out. So it's very complicated, but we should never give up the effort, never give up the effort to try to bring this war to an end through diplomacy. Like James Bond once said in the movie, never say never. And I say never here. And we just have to find a peaceful solution to the Ukraine war. It's just too dangerous.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Graham. And you've given us a lot of food for thought. And I'd like to introduce at this time Ambassador Goodby. Thank you for joining us, Ambassador Goodby. And he served under 5 presidents, Carter, Reagan, and Clinton. That's 3 presidents. And he was also ambassador to Finland. Ambassador Goodby has taught at Georgetown, Syracuse, and Carnegie Mellon Universities, and is Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus at Carnegie Mellon. He worked with former Secretary of State George Shultz at Hoover Institution at Stanford University, where he is a research fellow. And during his Foreign Service career, Ambassador Goodby was a negotiator or policy advisor in the creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the negotiation of the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, START, the Conference on Disarmament in Europe, and the Nunn-Lugar Program. He is the author and editor of several books and numerous articles and essays, and is a recipient of numerous awards, including the Presidential Distinguished Service Award. Ambassador Goodby, thank you so much for joining our discussion. And in light of the growing existential threat which nuclear weapons pose, and the complexity which Ambassador Graham has just taken us through, What would be your recommendations to our world leaders and diplomats about what should be done to address this problem, especially in light of the veiled threat to use nuclear weapons by President Putin?
Well, thank you, Audrey, for inviting me, and thank you for the introduction. Secretary of State George Shultz passed away several months ago. I had worked for him both at the State Department and for 15 years at the Hoover Institution. He was a great fan, obviously, of diplomacy. He often quoted to me something that Helmut Schmidt told him just as the Reagan administration was coming into office. And what Shultz said to Helmut Schmidt said to him was, he's terribly worried. I'm terribly worried, he said, because there's no human contact, and that's dangerous. And I agree with that. I think that Helmut Schmidt and Secretary of State Shultz were absolutely right to get something going, even in the depths of the crises that they were confronting. So I'd like to take the same approach. I think there is a role for diplomacy, and I think that contact is possible right now. I am alluding to the possibility of the Permanent Five, the P5 of the UN Security Council, meeting to discuss some issues that were actually agreed to in the draft final report of the NPT review conference, which, as I think everybody knows, was held last month, in August. And it produced what I consider to be an excellent report. Its only flaw was that it had in it a reference to the reactor in Ukraine that was in danger of being blown up by missiles. And because it had that reference, the Russian delegation was instructed to refuse to accept it. Since it had to be done by unanimity, then there was no report issued. But there were pages and pages, about 36 pages in all, in this report, and all the pages except for those few that dealt with that reactor in Ukraine were accepted. Now it happens that there were some recommendations made that I think are quite relevant to today's situation. For example, there was a discussion and a recommendation about, quote here, crisis prevention and crisis management. Another one on multilateral work on monitoring and verification, and another one on the refraining from the threat of use of nuclear weapons. I'll repeat that. A discussion of refraining from the threat or use of nuclear weapons. Now, it seems to me what the administration should do is call for a meeting of the P5 to discuss some of these issues in the final report that were basically agreed. And I don't know whether the Russians will accept that or not. My guess is that they would. The other members, of course, are France and Britain and China. And having China in the P5 is also an advantage because we do need to talk to the Chinese about these issues as well. So what I am recommending is that right now, the President or the Secretary of State appeal for the P5 to meet now without delay to discuss some of the issues that came up and were approved in the discussions in the UN last month concerning the final report of the NPT review conference. Now, what do you accomplish from that? And what are the criticisms of that? Well, of course, it wasn't very long ago, in fact, January 3 of this year, that the P5 agreed on a document which included in it a phrase or sentence that Ronald Reagan first used: a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. That was agreed to by all of the 5 members, including Russia, including China. And what that suggests to me, at any rate, is that they all agreed at that time, January 3 of this year, that a nuclear war was not a very good idea and it ought to be avoided. In fact, that was the general thrust of that document. Now, of course, you hear comments from Putin and others about nuclear war. So what does that piece of paper mean? And people will say, well, I think it's a good thing to try to say, okay, why aren't you abiding by that agreement that you signed just several months ago? So I think it's useful to have a discussion of that sort of thing, and I think it's possible to do that. Does it take you anywhere? Well, one of the mysteries of diplomacy is how do you get from here to there? And it's partly luck, partly just discussions, partly opportunity to enter into an issue that happens to come up in the course of our discussion on something else. In other words, just talking with people, not necessarily at the level of Putin and Xi, but pretty close to that, certainly the Secretary of State level, National Security Council level, and so forth. And ultimately, I would say yes, have the leaders come in themselves and talk about these things. The agreement I mentioned on January 3 was in fact signed by the leaders, including Xi and Putin and others. So that's my advice. Now, there's another negotiation that could take place, possibly pretty soon. And that has to do with an institution that I think not many people are familiar with. It's called the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's a descendant of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which negotiated something we informally called the Helsinki Accords, which were signed at the head of state level by Gerry Ford and Brezhnev and for the Soviet Union. And it had to do with a set of rules on how nations behave within that system of nations that included all of the European nations, the United States and also Canada. There were some 35 countries involved. They all agreed on human rights being an important part of international relations, and that there were certain standards that had to be applied. And I would argue that because of that agreement, the countries in Eastern Europe all eventually threw off the communist yoke, if you will, and became free and democratic independent nations. And I think that the current rendition of that accord, which is still relevant in terms of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, is something that needs to be revisited. It obviously was violated and bluntly, clearly by the Russians and their invasion of Ukraine. Does that mean it's useful? Not useful to discuss these things? Again, I say no. It is useful to have a discussion of these things. It's partly to get the record clear, and partly because there may come up things that will open up doors to new possibilities. For example, the agenda of the role of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe includes deploying long-term missions in various countries for various purposes. One of them is to monitor elections. One of them is to monitor troop movements. And by the way, there are 2 Ukrainians that have been arrested by the Russians. So the track record is not very good in terms of cooperation between Russia and the OSCE, as it's called. But nonetheless, there could be a role for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in a final settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. For example, by observing the removal of Russian forces from Ukraine. I think that having a meeting to talk about that probably doesn't take you very far right now. But again, diplomacy is about creating opportunities for breakthroughs, and you don't get a breakthrough unless you're talking to each other in some fairly sustained way. So my 2 ideas that I would leave with you now is simply get something going within the P5, and there is an agenda that I've outlined to you that comes straight out of an agreed document on the final report of the NPT Review Conference. The agreement on everything except that one issue of the reactors in Ukraine. That's one proposal that I make. I think I'd like to see the administration do something fairly soon about that. My other recommendation is not necessarily right away, but I think we should give some serious thought to having a meeting of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which, by the way, of course, includes Ukraine and Russia. Has 57 states in all, including several in Central Asia. So it is a useful organization in terms of the questions of Eurasia that come up from time to time in terms of what are Putin's objectives. So those are my proposals, and I think perhaps I could leave it at that and hope that we'll have a discussion of those ideas. Thank you very much for inviting me here.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Goodby. And you raised some really intriguing possibilities for solutions. And you had mentioned Eurasia. And can you comment more deeply on the growing questions about Northeast Asia and whether South Korea and Japan would defer to the P5 countries regarding their development of nuclear weapons?
Yes, you know that the issue of the North Korean nuclear weapons has been a hot button issue now for many years, and it's becoming, if it's possible, even hotter because of, the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, recently made a speech in which he talked about the preemptive use of North Korea's nuclear forces if the security of North Korea were in danger. That's the first time, I think, that he's talked about the preemptive use. It's typically he's talked about deterrence and using it in retaliation, that kind of thing. But now he's getting much more aggressive in his discussion about the uses of nuclear weapons. And he has also become much less interested in keeping alive the possibility of denuclearizing or eliminating nuclear weapons, it's more accurate probably, in the entire Korean peninsula. So the time has come to have some serious discussions, except that we're not having any. And again, we have from time to time had these discussions. Everybody probably remembers that President Trump met with Kim Jong-un 3 or 4 times, had very long and candid one-on-one discussions. I understand that there are letters from Kim Jong-un to President Trump in the cache of papers that were removed from Mar-a-Lago, so they must have been fairly interesting reports. I think we need to continue that kind of discussion, not necessarily at the level of President Biden at the present time, but I think we do need to talk with them, and we have, in fact, been saying that we're ready anytime, and we haven't received any particular interest in that from Kim Jong-un. But I don't think we've framed the issue correctly. What we probably should be doing is saying, we've heard what you've been saying, Mr. Kim Jong-un, and we're ready to talk with you and understand your thinking. And we'd like to have you understand our thinking. In other words, I think something can be done to begin some discussion again, even though you don't see clearly just how it might all end. So I do think that is essential. Otherwise, we are going to have a strong push on the part of North Korea's neighbors, South Korea and Japan, to acquire nuclear weapons of their own. So far, they've been dependent upon the United States nuclear umbrella, that is to say, an American commitment to use nuclear weapons if needed to deter an attack from North Korea. That worked pretty well. It worked so well that we actually have removed our nuclear weapons from South Korea. That was done by President George H.W. Bush when he was hoping there might be some positive things coming in the way of negotiations. And it did help, actually. It did help quite a lot. But typically, in the case of Korea, something almost always happens that derails it, and people sort of lose interest for a while until the North Koreans begin to make some trouble for somebody. And again, we get back to negotiations. We need to have a more sustained and long-term view of North Korea and a way of talking to them in good times and bad, which we currently do not have. But I think it's important that we find a way of doing it. And I think that we should have a quite senior person travel to North Korea, to Pyongyang, and have some discussions. We do have a representative. He's operating at the ambassador level, but I think somebody like the Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, could go there. She's a very effective negotiator, and I would love to see her talking in Pyongyang with with Kim Jong-un. So those are my proposals on that front.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Goodby. I mean, I'm really appreciating the deeper dive that we're getting from our two ambassadors on this webinar. And of course, there's never enough time to really address an even deeper dive into this important conversation. But at this time, I'd like to indicate that to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we did create a video, which is now historic, featuring former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz and former Soviet Union President Mikhail Gorbachev, discussing their recollections of the negotiations that led to the Reykjavik summit. And we have an inside view of the importance of the currency and processes of diplomacy in this clip. And it does, go over some of the grounds that have already been covered by both of our ambassadors today. So can we please play a clip of that video?
Three and a half decades ago, the world was moving very rapidly toward a Cold War, turning into a fire of destruction. In the United States and the Soviet Union, very public demonization had overcome reasoned political discourse, and the readiness to use nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction precariously hung over all of our heads. From the over 65,000 nuclear warheads then to the less than 14,000 today, progress has certainly been made. But the risks remain utterly unacceptable, and much needs to be done. This vision for a safer, nuclear weapons-free world remains to be fulfilled. That is our task today. It is thus an enormous honor to hear today from President Mikhail Gorbachev and Secretary of State George Shultz, two men who not only made history, it's really fair to say they helped save history. And for that, and I know I express this for millions of people, thank you so very much.
Mikhail, you were dynamite when you were in office. You had imagination, you had strength, you had vision, and you changed things. And with your option under President Reagan, you changed the world. I'm in my 100th year, but I feel like a promising young man. Trust is the coin of the realm. So that built, and I think it was part of the evolution of the relationship between two personal giants, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. And they could interact comfortably with each other because they trusted each other. They knew that the other one would do whatever they said they would do. So that was a big thing.
Особенно я хотел сказать, вложи все эмоциональное, что в моей душе существует, что хуже всего то, что в последние годы произошел коллапс доверия в отношениях между ведущими державами, которые, согласно Уставу ООН, несут главную ответственность за поддержание международного права, за безопасность, который по-прежнему обладает огромными запасами ядерного оружия и обязаны его сокращать, вплоть до его ликвидации. Это обязательство договора о нераспространении никто не отменял. Я с огромной тревогой вынужден говорить, о милитаризации международных отношений. Это результат вот всех этих ошибок, которые допущены, промахов, крупных, опасных. Проблемы, конфликты последних 2 десятилетий, которые вполне можно было бы урегулировать мирными политическими, дипломатическими средствами, пытались решить путем применения силы. Так было и в бывшей Югославии, и в Ираке, и в Ливии, и в Сирии. Хочу подчеркнуть, что это не привело к решению проблем. Результатом стало расшатывание международного права, подрыв доверия, милитаризации. Милитаризация как политики, так и мышления всего. И в этих условиях говорить о движении к безъядерному миру становится все труднее. Это надо честно признать. Пока мировая политика не вернется в нормальную колею, пока не произойдет демилитаризация международных отношений, цель, совместно обозначенная в Рейкьявике, будет не приближаться, а отдаляться. Чтобы изменить такое положение, необходим диалог. Фактически отказ от него в последние годы был самой большой ошибкой. Давно уже пора возобновить его по всей повестке дня, не ограничиваясь обсуждением региональных проблем, по которым существует разногласие. В годы, когда мы покончили с холодной войной, мы признали, что помимо национальных и иных интересов есть общие интересы, прежде всего предотвращение ядерной войны.
So there was supposed to be a meeting in Washington, and the Soviets sent word saying they'd like to have a preliminary meeting before the Washington meeting. We said Reykjavik would be okay because it's isolated. Hofty House had it downstairs, and there was a little room on the side. That's where we met. The room was very small. Reagan's at one end, Gorbachev's at the other end. I'm sitting beside Reagan. Shevardnadze beside Gorbachev. That's all the interpreters. So it's very intimate discussion. We were there for 2 days, and we had real exchanges. And on the first day, morning, Gorbachev laid on the table all of our negotiating points. He was agreeing to them, all of them. We were astonished. We went back and talked with over our group. And then all of a sudden, he put a condition on everything, that we have to kill the Strategic Defense Initiative. And Reagan had proposed this, and his idea was that people will find ballistic missiles, and somehow you have to defend yourself against them. And he wasn't about to give it up. So we had, on the one hand, huge amount of progress, including a world free of nuclear weapons. In the end, we couldn't agree on anything. We did agree in a separate negotiation that human rights would be a regular, recognized item on our agenda. That was a breakthrough. I mean, it's a very important marker. Then we had the Washington Summit, which the INF Treaty was signed. That was first big breakthrough, reducing and eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. And these were relatively short-range ones, which were very dangerous because the amount of time between when they're fired and when they hit is like nothing. And so the chance to defend yourself is minimal. That took place at Reykjavik.
После того, что было сказано, что ядерная война недопустима, что в ней не может быть победителей, и что она нельзя остаться в такой ситуации, что надо заняться всей этой нагромождением этим и избавляться от ядерного оружия. Думаю, что Рейкьявик – это действительно то, что останется в истории навсегда. Ибо не будь Рейкьявика того, что хоть и с трудом, но что последовало после него, как начала меняться ситуация и отношения, Мы могли прийти такой, когда ядерное оружие могло при его масштабах и вырваться из-под контроля политического. Поэтому надо было сделать. И мы пошли. Переговоры были интенсивными, очень основательными, прямыми. Были президенты, были министры иностранных дел с ними. И была большая группа инспекторов политических и военных, экспертов. Удивительно, что все как бы чувствовали, что здесь что-то произойти должно серьезное, что изменить всю ситуацию в мире. Все. Обычно неугомонные представители прессы ждали. Точно так же, как и все мы, видели, что получается. Мы начали выходить и на договоренности, означающие какие-то детали. То есть все можно, решается. И вот когда вдруг появилась тема о стратегической оборонной инициативе, я и сейчас даже не могу сказать, что полностью убежден, что вот это как бы продуманная, выношенная идея. Получается, что вроде бы американцы не очень-то хотели, боялись. Ведь не зря же, не случайно Тэтчер сказала, еще один Рейкьявик мы не выдержим. Не очень они хотели, хотя по разговорах Рейган иногда даже первым говорил, мы должны идти к безъядерному миру. Поэтому это было самое большое потрясение. И вот драматическое продолжение этой ситуации выглядело так, что мы, договорившись практически обо всем, мы могли получить уже в Рейкьявике готовый документ. И все оборвалось. Это было, конечно, вообще. Нас заставило это очень серьезно думать о наших партнерах. С какими мыслями, с какими планами, какие у них расчеты. И особенно для меня было важно то, что Шульц, улетая с Рейкьявика, в беседе с журналистами, сказал, что, к сожалению, не состоялось. Высказал разочарование в связи с тем, что разрыв не состоялся. Я за этот тезис надо было развенчать. Потому что мы так много сделали, действительно заглянули за горизонт, что там уже в безъядерном мире. Отдать такое на съедение, на уничтожение реакционным силам, прямо скажем, это было бы недопустимо и непростительно. Я сказал, все рассказал как есть. И сказал, что это прорыв. На утро Шульцу доложили, что я сказал, и он собрал тут же пресс-конференцию и присоединился в Соединенные Штаты. Это, конечно, надо воздать должное Шульцу. Он вообще играл весьма конструктивную и позитивную роль.
As the Reykjavik meeting was winding down, Mikhail Gorbachev took me aside and said, "George, you've seen the Promised Land and didn't get there." I said, "Mikhail, so have you, and you didn't get there. And the reason is you had a roadblock on our learning how to prevent ourselves by being hit from a ballistic missile. So if we prohibit them, let's get rid of all this stuff." And we parted. Since then, things have gone downhill. People think of all kinds of reasons not to do the work. But there is something hopeful beyond simply a belief that a worthwhile goal is to get to the Promised Land. I'm really excited to know that the National Academy of Sciences here has, with some very prominent physicists, once again in touch with their counterparts in Russia, and they're meeting fairly frequently, lining out possible positions and problems, and also getting to know each other. This is a very good development, and it is supported by the fact that the Vatican and the Russian Orthodox Church are trying to do something of similar nature. So, with all of the gloom and doom people are spreading, forget it. Something good is happening. And in the end, the good things will prevail.
Dear friends, my nuclear journey began 75 years ago. In the summer of 1945, I was a U.S. Marine captain on a troop ship in the Pacific bound for San Diego. Early in the voyage, we heard that something called an atomic bomb had been dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. By the time we reached port in San Diego, a second bomb had been used at Nagasaki. We wouldn't be headed to the Japanese mainland after all. Ronald Reagan believed that nuclear weapons were immoral. My friend Bishop Swing has rightly observed that while the U.S. President may put his hand on the Bible at his inauguration, it is when he puts his hand on the nuclear trigger that he assumes a godlike power. But we are men, not gods. Together with President Gorbachev, we had seen the Promised Land, but we had not been able to get there during our negotiations. Today, I am alarmed. We live in an unsafe world that grows more dangerous with the proliferation of nuclear weapons. We need to make sure that the global population understands the gravity of the nuclear threat, and we do everything we can to reduce the risks of that threat. But I am also optimistic. I see that wise and knowledgeable people are talking about these crucial issues. Such dialogue can lead to progress, so there is hope. I have seen the Promised Land, so I know that it exists, and the leaders who can take us there can emerge from among our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Sincerely yours, George P. Shultz.
Дорогие друзья, я был очень рад узнать от моего друга Джорджа Шульца, что в связи с 75-й годовщиной атомной бомбардировки Хиросимы ваша организация планирует выступить с совместным заявлением о необходимости ликвидации ядерного оружия. As a passionate appeal to join the fight for a nuclear weapon-free future for all mankind. Fighting for the abolition of nuclear weapons is the civic duty of each and every one of us. Together with you, I am appealing to the citizens of all countries. Put pressure on your leaders, politicians, and elected officials. Keep telling them again and again that the very existence of nuclear weapons poses a deadly threat to humanity. Demand that they take concrete action so that the arsenals of nuclear weapons get smaller with every passing year. We started on the road to a world without nuclear weapons in Reykjavik. It turned out to be a difficult and thorny path. But there must be no other goal than the complete elimination, the abolition of nuclear weapons. I wish you the strength of spirit, dedication, and perseverance in advancing that goal. С уважением, Mikhail Gorbachev.
Our next speaker is Jonathan Granoff. He is an attorney, author, and international advocate, emphasizing the legal and ethical dimensions of human development and security, focusing on advancing the rule of law to address global security and the threats posed by nuclear weapons. Mr. Granoff is a senior advisor and the United Nations representative of the Permanent Secretariat of the World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates. He's delivered expert testimony before the US Congress, the parliaments of the United Kingdom and Canada, and the UN Security General's Disarmament Advisory Board. He was a Nobel Peace Prize nominee in 2014 and is an award-winning screenwriter. Jonathan, you've written and spoken extensively about human security. Please share your thoughts with us about illusory security and human security in the context of the real threat which nuclear weapons pose. You now have the floor.
Audrey, that video that we just watched is overwhelming in its clarity, appropriateness, relevance, depth, and inspiration. And it showed somehow the character of these two people, the fullness of their humanity shone through. And that, of course, is what's missing right now, is that we're stuck in illusions that the quest for territory and domination of people is a valid endeavor. I want to quote context, the context of all of this. Albert Einstein said, "The splitting of the atom changed everything except our thinking, so we drift toward catastrophe." Our thinking has to change. Our thinking changed in the 17th century from the domination of the Holy Roman Empire and the political and economic relations in Europe to nation states. Within 100 years, nation states became normative. They didn't exist as we know it before 1648, when nation states were created to stop the killing of Protestants and Catholics in the 30 Years' War. Thinking changed, institutions changed, values changed. I want to quote from Mikhail Gorbachev. I had the privilege recently, he's passed away, this was last autumn, of a meeting for the Global Alliance of Leaders in Kazakhstan, convened by Nursultan Nazarbayev, who led in giving up a nuclear arsenal in excess of 1,400 nuclear weapons in Kazakhstan. And Ambassador Graham was instrumental in negotiating the elimination of that arsenal. So he convened a group of world leaders, and President Gorbachev sent a letter to that group, directly answering the question that you just posed. It's interesting how relevant and prescient that letter was. And I had the privilege of delivering it in English, delivering it at the conference. He said, "It is necessary now to rethink our concept of security. Up until now, it has been envisioned mostly in military terms. The priority now must be given to human security. It means, above all, providing food, water, and a clean environment, and caring for people's health. This is what our efforts should be devoted to. This should be the responsibility of governments and leaders of all levels." He continued, "Nuclear weapons are like a rifle that is hanging on the wall and is bound one day to fire accidentally as a result of technical failure
or of human or computer error. There have been so many examples in aviation and industry and various control systems of accidents related to electronics or computers. Nuclear weapons could also be launched in response to false alarms. They could fall into the hands of terrorists. Who knows what other surprises they may have in store for us? The proponents of nuclear weapons are claiming that they guarantee peace and security and that they have saved the world from war. My response to them is, this is a dangerous myth in a dangerous world. So I will never tire of repeating, we need to demilitarize global politics, international relations, and political thinking to rid them of the nuclear sword of Damocles. Everyone can contribute to this goal. Ordinary citizens, scientists, artists, and of course, political leaders. Now, changing from a military nationalist framework of pursuing security to global human security is part of the process of addressing the great other existential threat of our time, climate change, because no nation can protect the climate. It's something that affects everybody. Even pandemics, a simple virus has realized that passports are not necessary to wreak havoc on the human family. And as we burn the polar ice cap, systemically pouring billions and billions of gallons of water into the oceans and literally changing the pH of the oceans, we put at risk our ability to breathe because 50 to 70% of our oxygen comes from phytoplankton that depends on the health of the oceans. So we are in a new world in which the focus on borders and military procurements is unable to address the fullness of threats that we're facing. So human security has to be the change. Now, some people say, oh, that's just an idea. We can't do it this season. And I certainly agree with Ambassador Graham that in today, and tomorrow, and this week, we're not in a situation where we can make that breakthrough. And I very much agree with Ambassador Goodby that dialogue is absolutely essential in all circumstances. I recently co-authored an op-ed in The Hill with Oscar Arias, who miraculously ended 4 civil wars in Central America when no one said it could be done. And he gave tangible proposals that we need to prepare for negotiations when the season allows it. But more important than ever, is that we have to push for the emergence of a new approach to security that's based on the realism of science and the values that make us human. So I was privileged to be at a session with a man well known to both of these diplomats with us, a genius of diplomacy, Max Kampelman. Max Kampelman was a very close advisor to President Reagan. And I was with him in a meeting with the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, discussing this subject. And at the time of it, situation was not optimum for progress. And Ambassador Kampelman said, think of the ought. Put the ought in front of us at all times. What ought we to do? Put the ideal there and strive for it. When the United States was created, it was created by an ought. Thomas Jefferson said, all men are created equal and endowed with precious treasures that go right to the core of our humanity, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, when he said it, men without property were not included at that moment. Neither were women of color. No women were included. Indigenous people weren't included. But within the seed of that idea is the legitimacy now that every government points to. It is the people that determine the right of government to govern. All over, even the worst tyrants pay the price of hypocrisy for it. In a fairly short period of time, a few hundred years, that idea has changed the political legitimacy of every government and the landscape of the world. So don't be cynical about an idea, an ideal, and think that it's not powerful, and think that it can't create change. So I would say this is the time in which President Gorbachev's admonition to put human security central is really important and understandable, because geopolitics are difficult for the person on the street trying to get by to understand. But their personal human security, they can understand. And it's consistent with what we just saw with the testimony of Secretary Shultz and President Gorbachev. As President Shultz reduced it to the foundation of diplomacy, trust is the currency of the realm. Right now we have a trust deficit. Right now we have a media and a social media system that amplifies distrust, amplifies discord, and diminishes reason and unity. It even, I would venture to say that most Americans are totally unaware of any of our diplomats other than our Secretary of State, and thus really demean the importance of the profession of diplomacy. Because if the words of diplomats fail to have meaning in practice, then verbs become bullets, because that's the only way that governments can talk to each other if they can't talk through their diplomats. America couldn't have come into existence without the diplomacy of Benjamin Franklin, without the diplomacy of John Adams, without the diplomacy of Thomas Jefferson and John Jay. They were as important as the military leaders that led in the American Revolution, because force only gets you so far, but building bridges between countries gets you home. That's what we learned in the difference between World War I and World War II. Force and more force was imposed on the vanquished in World War I. The treaties of Versailles that put burdens on the German people led to the chaos of Nazism. The wisdom of applying our highest human values in the Marshall Plan, which was both geopolitically wise, but it was human. We built the economies and cultures of the vanquished, of Germany and Japan, ended up with democracies and trading partners. Cynics would say, well, that's kind of idealism, and the only reason we did it was to contain the Soviet Union. It's not true. It's part of the nature of a country that was confident because it was victorious. It was confident in our humanity. The only difference, only nuance I would say from the whole presentation that you're letting me come in last after these fantastic presentations by these two towering diplomats and two towering world leaders is in Geneva in 1985, when President Reagan and Gorbachev met, that's when they said a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. But in the same paragraph, they ended the paragraph and said, neither party shall seek military advantage over the other. In other words, they affirmed common security amongst nations. And they then built a bridge of trust that could lead us out of the Cold War into a much safer world. Where we are today is very hazardous waters, but we can never, ever give up the principle of what ought to be where we need to push to go. And I would propose that every political leader has to be seized of these issues and should be asked, what are you doing to eliminate poverty, something which humanity could never do before, but we have the technological means to do it and the resources to do it? What are you doing to protect the climate? Because that involves changing literally how we move our bodies and heat our homes. We don't really move our bodies. We move big hunks of metal and we put our bodies in the metal. And what are you doing to eliminate nuclear weapons? What plans do you have? Are you building bridges with your counterparts in other countries? Are you building a coalition of countries that will move in that direction? Are you supporting the commitments that we've already made in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? And all of us should be thanking Ambassador Graham for leading the negotiations of the United States in gaining its indefinite extension, wherein our country, the United States, made commitments to ban nuclear testing, to negotiate the elimination of production of any further fissile materials, strengthen safeguards, lower the salience of the weapons, many things that need to still be done. And every politician should be seized of that. And I think every one of us as human beings needs to reflect on what is it that's most precious to our humanity. And I propose that people will come up with something that isn't trite. They'll say loving one another is most precious, having compassion for others, helping others is what's important. And I would end with Jesus' admonition to love God with all our soul, all our might, and love your neighbor as yourself. And in today's world, as never before, neighborhood is not a physical location, it's a moral location. And the climate change and the pandemic has made any person who can add 2 and 2 together know that the world is one family today and human security is an imperative.
Thank you so much, Jonathan Granoff. And we have just enough time for 1-minute conclusory comments from, we'll begin in the order that we started this webinar. Ambassador Graham, what is the one conclusory comment you would like to impress upon all of our viewers today?
The one comment I would like to make is to understand that the war in Ukraine affects us all, and it involves three parties that have made it existential and have left no door open for solution. And we have to find a way to bridge that very difficult problem. There's been so much fighting, so many people killed, so many terrible developments for the population. It just has to end, and there must be a way that we haven't yet perceived to end all this. And restore the region and ultimately the world to peace. As Prime Minister Modi at the Shanghai Communique meeting last week said to President Putin, this is not the time for war, and it definitely is not.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Graham. Ambassador Goodby, final thought, please.
I would say this: never, never, never give up fighting for those issues that are so important to the survival of humanity. If you give up, we've lost. Just keep on fighting, and it's disappointing to see so little progress. In fact, retrograde things happening right now. But that doesn't mean we should give up. Never be fatalistic about this, because I believe that we can win this battle and humanity will survive. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So we keep fighting for peace. So thank you so much, Jonathan Granoff. Your concluding thoughts, please.
The moral foundation of my concluding thought is love, people, use, things. States are things. We create states in order to express our values and protect ourselves. And I believe most leaders in the world in most states today realize that our differences are far less than the things that have to bring us together. So this is a time in which coalitions can be built. And this is a time in which the failure of diplomacy is not an option. So I totally agree with both Ambassador Graham and Ambassador Goodby. We need to emphasize at every juncture, the importance of diplomacy, the rule of law, and finding common ground. Is this going to be easy? No. But we can make progress in building those coalitions. A month ago, India was not in alignment with the United States on this issue. That's a sixth of the world's population has moved there. I think China is going to move. China understands that the invasion of neighboring countries and annexing them is not the future for the world. So coalitions can be built, and we have to address lowering the crisis as fast as possible. And the principle remains, at which we saw, amazingly, the affection of Secretary Shultz and Mikhail Gorbachev, who just earlier were, a year before, they met in Geneva, were demonizing each other, threatening absolutely. And they showed us that if their humanity can be met, progress can be made. So Albert Einstein's admonition in his manifesto that he wrote with Albert Einstein and the great philosopher Bertrand Russell, two founders of the World Academy of Arts and Science, by the way, where I'm a fellow. They said, remember your humanity, forget the rest.
Thank you so much, Jonathan Granoff. And I really want to express my deepest appreciation to Ambassador Graham, Ambassador Goodby, and Jonathan Granoff for their contributions to this very important and fascinating discussion. George Shultz and Mikhail Gorbachev said that they had looked over the horizon into a world without nuclear weapons and seen the promised land. While they were disappointed at not achieving their goal at the Reykjavik summit, they remained hopeful. We look to our world leaders and their team of diplomats and experts to seek peaceful solutions to the nuclear weapons issue. And may we remember the words of Gorbachev and Shultz in the video that trust is the currency of diplomacy, but not only in diplomacy, but in all of our relationships as well. May we work toward developing and building trust to make this world a nuclear weapons-free world, and realize true human security does not lie in increases in nuclear weapons, but in the development of our relationships and relationality to our environment. May we all develop the same goal that will allow us to embrace caring for each other and our environment through the cultivation of the currency of trust. Thank you all for joining us today, and may you have a very good evening. Thank you, everyone. Aloha.